Eli Carter had lived on the same patch of land for 15 long years. His small wooden house stood at the edge of the Arizona desert, far from any road, far from any visitor. The place was quiet except for the wind that whistled through the dry grass and the creak of the old windmill that pumped water from the ground. Every morning Eli woke before sunrise, boiled coffee on the stove, and walked out to feed his horse, Dusty. It was a routine that never changed, a life so silent that even time seemed to move slower there. He wasn't always alone. Once he had friends, a few family members, and a reason to ride into town every Saturday. But one by one those things drifted away. His parents had passed, his old friends moved east for work, and the woman he once hoped to marry had chosen someone else. Eli never blamed her. He just stopped expecting anything from life. He built a fence around his heart the way he built one around his land, strong, plain, and meant to keep things out. The townspeople spoke of him with half pity, half mystery. "That Carter fella," they'd whisper, "lives like a ghost." Children who saw him ride into town for supplies would stare at him as though he came from another world. He hardly spoke, only tipping his hat and leaving quietly. Still, those who knew him said he had never turned anyone away who needed help. If a horse went lame on the trail, he'd stop to fix it. If a storm ruined a neighbor's roof, he'd show up with a hammer. But when the work was done, he'd go back home to his empty land and his quiet fire. That spring, the desert began to change. The rains came early and the air smelled fresh after every storm. Wildflowers covered the dry plains, painting the land with purple and gold. One afternoon, as Eli was repairing a broken fence near the south boundary, he noticed something unusual on the horizon. 3 riders approaching slowly from the hills. At first he thought they were travelers passing through, but as they drew closer he could see they were Apache women. Their long dark hair moved in the wind, and they rode with calm confidence, guiding their horses side by side. Eli wiped his brow and leaned on the fence post as the 3 stopped near his gate. He had known Apache families years ago, traded with them sometimes, and once helped carry water to their village during a drought. But he hadn't spoken to anyone from their tribe in years. The women dismounted with grace, their movements quiet and sure. The oldest of the 3 stepped forward. She was in her late 20s, strong and composed, wearing a handmade dress of soft buckskin decorated with small turquoise beads. "You are Eli Carter," she said in steady English. Eli nodded, curious. "That's right. You come a long way from the hills." The woman glanced at her companions, then back at him. "We came because we know your name. You helped our people once long ago when the river dried. You brought water and food when no one else cared." Eli rubbed the back of his neck, surprised that anyone remembered. "That was a long time ago." "Didn't seem like much." The woman smiled slightly. "To us it was. We do not forget kindness, and we came for another reason." The second girl, younger and quieter, stepped forward. Her eyes were gentle and she spoke softly. "We watched you these years. You live alone, always working, always silent. Our mother said you carry a heart that still waits for warmth." Eli didn't know what to say. He had never thought anyone was watching his life unfold from afar. Before he could answer, the eldest sister took a deep breath and said words that stopped his heart for a moment. "We came to ask if you would marry the 3 of us." Eli blinked, certain he misheard. He even laughed once, softly. "I reckon I didn't catch that right." "You did," she said calmly. "We are sisters. Our ways are not like yours. In our belief, love is shared through spirit, not numbers. You are a good man. You lived right even when the world turned its back. You kept your word to our people. We came to offer you our companionship, our care, our lives." For a long moment, all Eli could hear was the wind. He felt like the ground had vanished under his boots. That's a mighty big thing to ask a man who ain't spoken to a soul in 15 years, he said finally. The youngest of the 3, barely more than 20, tilted her head with a shy smile. "Then maybe it is time to speak again." The oldest sister added, "You don't need to answer now. We came because we saw the good in you, not because of what you have." Rain clouds were gathering again over the distant mountains. A cool wind swept through and the smell of wet earth filled the air. Eli gestured toward the small cabin behind his barn. "Storm's coming. You can stay there tonight if you like." "It's dry and warm." The women nodded gratefully. They led their horses to the stable and carried small packs into the cabin. That evening, Eli cooked beans, coffee, and cornbread, placing a plate by their door. He didn't join them, not yet. He sat alone by the fire inside his house, staring at the flickering flames. Their words kept replaying in his head. Marry the three of us. It was something he never imagined hearing in his lifetime. He thought about the years he had lost, the silence that had wrapped around his soul like a heavy blanket. He remembered the times he had stood at the porch watching the sunset with no one beside him. Maybe he had gotten too used to being alone. Maybe he had convinced himself it was all he deserved. But these three women had looked at him not as a ghost of the past, but as a man still capable of giving and receiving care. Outside, thunder rolled, and rain began to fall on the tin roof. Eli listened to it for a long time. He wondered who had sent them, fate, chance, or perhaps something higher that had finally decided to give him company after all these years. In the cabin, the sisters were singing softly in their language, a calm, rhythmic tune that drifted across the yard. Eli sat by the window, eyes closed, letting the sound fill the emptiness that had lived inside him for so long. He didn't sleep much that night. He watched the flames die down and thought about what it meant to be alone, what it meant to share a life again. It wasn't about custom or fear of gossip. He knew what the townspeople would say if they ever learned of this, but their laughter didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet peace he felt when he heard those voices through the rain. When morning came, the storm had passed. The sky was soft blue and puddles shimmered in the sunlight. Eli walked outside, still unsure what he would say. He found the sisters feeding Dusty, laughing as the old horse tried to nudge them for more oats. The sight made him smile for the first time in years. The eldest sister saw him and called out, "Good morning, Eli Carter." He nodded. "Morning to you. Did you think about what we said?" she asked. He paused, then looked at the open land stretching miles around them. "I did a lot of thinking. Haven't thought this much in a long time," the younger sister said gently. "Sometimes thinking is the first step toward healing." He didn't answer right away. He just looked at them, their calm faces, their easy laughter, their confidence. Something inside him began to soften. Maybe this was how life offered second chances, quietly, without warning, on a day when you least expected it. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the red hills, Eli stood on his porch, watching the three sisters walk toward the horizon. They said they would return tomorrow for his answer. He nodded as they rode away, feeling something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Hope. He whispered to himself, "Maybe I've been waiting 15 years for a knock like that." As the desert wind brushed against his face, Eli Carter knew his lonely days might finally be ending. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to find out. The next morning, the air felt fresh and new. The rain had washed away the dust, and the desert looked alive again. The birds were singing, and the smell of wet earth hung softly around the ranch. Eli Carter stepped out of his small house and looked across the open land. He hadn't slept much, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Something inside him was changing, something that no fence or silence could hold back anymore. He saw the three Apache sisters riding back toward his ranch, just as the sun began to climb. They looked calm and graceful, their horses moving in rhythm with the morning wind. Eli felt his chest tighten a little. He didn't know what words he would use or how to explain the thoughts that had filled his mind through the night. He only knew that after 15 years of quiet living, he was ready to listen to his heart again. The eldest sister stopped her horse near the porch. "Good morning, Eli Carter," she said kindly. "Morning," he replied, tipping his hat. "You three ride early." "We said we'd return for your answer," she said with a small smile. Eli looked at the ground for a moment, then met her eyes. "I thought about what you said," he began slowly. "I thought about how strange it sounded at first, but then I realized something. I've been living here with nothing but silence for too long. Maybe it's time I let life back in again." The middle sister, who always spoke softly, stepped forward. "And what does your heart say?" He took a deep breath and said, "My heart says, yes. I may not understand all the ways of your people, but I do understand kindness, loyalty, and respect. And if that's what you offer, then I'll meet it with the same." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then the youngest sister smiled and said gently, "Then let this day be the first day of your new life." Eli nodded, his voice quiet. "I reckon it is." That day marked the beginning of something no one in the nearby towns could have ever imagined. The quiet cowboy who had lived alone for 15 years suddenly had company on his ranch. At first it felt strange. Eli wasn't used to hearing laughter in the mornings or songs drifting from the porch in the evening. He found himself pausing during chores just to listen to their voices. It was as if the wind itself had started carrying new life across his land. The eldest sister, whose name was Naya, took charge of the garden. She had a calm and steady nature, always patient, always knowing what needed to be done. The middle sister, Asha, loved to paint with natural colors on stones and wood, decorating the porch with patterns of the sun and moon. The youngest, Lita, was full of energy and joy. She spent hours talking to Dusty, Eli's horse, and swore he understood every word she said. Eli watched all this quietly, amazed at how his lonely home had become full of warmth and laughter. He had forgotten how good it felt to sit by a fire with someone beside him, to share a meal cooked with care, to hear gentle words after a long day's work. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the desert in red and gold, Naya sat beside him on the porch. She looked at him with kind eyes. "You live a simple life, Eli Carter," she said softly. "But simple can be beautiful when there is peace." Eli smiled faintly. "I guess I used to think peace meant silence, but now I know peace can mean hearing someone laugh near you." Naya nodded. "Yes, peace is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of good hearts." That night they all sat together by the fire. Asha told stories from her village, about how the stars were once campfires of ancient warriors, and how every rain carried the whispers of those who had walked the earth before them. Lita tried to teach Eli a few words in Apache, laughing whenever he said them wrong. For the first time in years, Eli laughed with her, a sound he had nearly forgotten he could make. Days turned into weeks, and soon the ranch looked different. Flowers grew along the fence line. The porch had wind chimes that sang when the wind passed, and the once empty cabin had colorful blankets and handmade pottery inside. Travelers who rode past the area would sometimes stop and stare, surprised to hear singing where once there had been only silence. The townsfolk eventually heard the rumors. Some said the old cowboy had lost his mind. Others said he had found magic in the desert. Eli didn't care what anyone said. He had spent too many years caring about other people's opinions. What mattered was what he felt each morning when he woke up, a sense of belonging that no amount of solitude could ever replace. One afternoon, Eli was mending a fence while Lita brought him water. "You work too much," she said teasingly. He chuckled. "Old habits die hard." "Then let new habits live," she replied, handing him the water with a smile. He took a sip and looked across the open land. The air shimmered with heat, but for the first time in his life he felt the desert didn't look empty anymore. It looked alive, because of them. Later that summer they held a small ceremony under the wide desert sky. It wasn't like the weddings in town with suits, preachers, or fancy words. It was simple and pure. Naya placed a hand over his heart and said, "Where your heart stands, our hearts will stand." Asha gave him a handmade necklace of carved stone, and Lita placed a feather in his hat. Eli didn't speak much. He just said, "I'll never take this life for granted again." That night they sat by the fire again. The stars stretched endlessly above them, and the wind carried the smell of sagebrush and blooming cactus. Eli looked around the circle, at Naya's calm smile, Asha's soft eyes, and Lita's bright laugh. He felt like a man reborn. Years passed, and their life together grew steady like the rhythm of the seasons. They worked the land, helped travelers, and shared their food with anyone who needed it. Some winters were hard, some summers too dry, but the peace in their hearts never faded. Eli often thought about how strange life was, how 15 years of silence could be washed away by the laughter of 3 women who rode in with the rain. He never went back to living alone again. The sisters became part of his story, and his ranch became part of theirs. They built a home full of music, friendship, and respect. Visitors who came by would often speak of the calmness they felt there, as if the air itself carried a kind of blessing. Eli Carter grew older, but his spirit stayed strong. When people asked about his life, he would smile, tip his hat, and say, "Once I thought the desert was empty. Turns out it was just waiting to be filled." And on quiet evenings, when the sun turned the sky orange and gold, he could still hear Naya humming softly, Asha's laughter blending with Lita's cheerful chatter. The ranch that was once silent now had the sound of love, peace, and life that never left. Those who passed through that part of Arizona would sometimes say they saw the old cowboy sitting on his porch, his hat tilted low, watching the horizon with 3 graceful women tending the land around him. Some called it a legend, others called it a miracle. But those who knew Eli Carter simply said it was the story of a man who waited 15 years for the rain. And when it finally came, it brought 3 hearts that turned his lonely world into home.